after the breakup of the Soviet Union. The Russian president's demand that Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO has been rejected. Well, let's talk now to the former commander of the United States Army's operations in Europe, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who joins me live on the programme from Frankfurt. Ben Hodges, welcome here. Just why don't you start by your assessment of where we currently are? Does it look to you inevitable now that we will see some sort of invasion by the Russians?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I don't want to say inevitable, but I think it's very likely. And of course, it's important to remember that Russia has already invaded Ukraine. They did this in 2014. They still occupy Crimea and Donbass. So what we're talking about is the possibility, and I think the likelihood of a new offensive, an expansion of what they're already doing.
And if that transpires, as you say, how dangerous is that, do you think?
Well, of course, the Kremlin has put an awful lot of capability in place on three sides of Ukraine, if you will. They have significant bridgeheads in Crimea and Donbass. Their Navy forces are beginning to converge into the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. So they've got an awful lot of capability in place. And I think probably in another 2 or 3 weeks, it'll all be set. That doesn't mean it's going to be a giant big red arrow going across Ukraine. I actually think they want to maintain as much pressure in place in hopes that the alliance cracks, that we give in to some of their outrageous demands so that he doesn't actually have to take the next step. But I think he will go for some limited objectives along the coastline. He's got to have something to show for all of this.
I'll come back to that point in a moment, but in terms of the tactics we've seen from Washington and the Western capitals, have they got it right that there is clarity about the severity of sanctions that would follow any sort of invasion, any sort of incursion?
I am very confident that the administration and the other allied governments have made it clear to their Russian counterparts about the nature and the severity of the type sanctions that would be implemented. The problem, and I'm glad, I think the administration is actually correcting this. Up until now, it's been more of deterrence through the threat of punishment, which in my mind is not nearly as compelling as deterrence through demonstrated capability and will. So you're seeing the delivery of more and more equipment from the United States and the UK. Secretary Austin alerted the American contribution to the NATO response force so that they're ready to move if necessary. So this is more compelling in terms of deterrence than just threatening sanctions.
I was talking to Moscow, a Russian MP, only a little earlier, and we've seen it over the years, over countless examples of muddying the water. You remember the poisoning incident in Salisbury, just a long, long list. In terms of their tactics, in terms of narrative, Moscow continues to say it's the West that's exacerbating this situation, is to blame for this situation. How should the West deal with those sorts of tactics, that sort of narrative?
Well, look, if this wasn't so serious, it would be laughable, the fairy tale that comes out of the Kremlin. I mean, let's remember, since the formation of NATO in 1949, not once did any member of NATO ever attempt to violate the sovereignty of the Soviet Union. And then after the end of the Soviet Union, when Russia was at its weakest, the NATO did not invade Russia. In fact, we sent home all of our tanks. The British Army left the continent. The Bundeswehr practically disarmed. So the safest part of Russia is the part, that 6% of its entire frontier that touches NATO. That's the one place I can guarantee that they'll never be attacked from. So this fairy tale that it's the fault of the West that has caused all this, that's a fairy tale that he aims primarily at his own audience.
Just 30 seconds, if you would. If there are movements across the border, if that prompts sanctions and there's the rupture, as Moscow describes it, in terms of relations between Moscow and the West, just your assessment of what a rupture would actually mean.
Well, of course, part of the bullying tactic of the Kremlin is to try and put so much pressure on us that some countries will finally break and say, come on, we'll promise this or we'll give up this. And I think the best way to make sure that there is no rupture is that we stick together and that we're firm. I mean, we know this from hundreds of years of history. When we crack, that's when a real rupture happens, and we'll just keep dealing with this in the years down the line.
Ben Hodges, great to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.